Supermassive Games released Until Dawn in 2015 and unleashed a pick-your-own-adventure, cinema-style story to the world, and it was jam-packed with countless horror tropes to make sure everyone had something to be afraid of. Over the span of about 10 to 15 hours, players would watch a story unfold in which their choices carried meaning on whether teenagers lived or died, and while that may have been the most interesting part of the game, it's not what I want to focus on today. Instead, I want to use Until Dawn as a reference point to discuss what we call phobias, because the game is littered with examples that may stir up uneasiness in its players. Everyone is afraid of something, and more than likely, Until Dawn includes something that you're terrified of, whether it be in a small dose or serve as a driving force of the plot. So today, in this episode of Psychology of Gaming, the series where we look at how psychological principles are worked into games, and how games can affect us psychologically, we take a look at how Until Dawn incorporates phobias into not only the visuals, but into its core gameplay, while also examining what phobias are, how they form, and how they can be cured. I want to start by looking at some of the phobias that Until Dawn puts on display throughout its campaign, but first it would help to know how psychologists define a phobia. Phobia is a persistent and excessive fear or anxiety about a specific stimulus, whether it be a situation or an object. The easiest phobias pertain to fear of objects, such as a fear of snakes, or a fear of spiders, a fear of scarecrows, or something else much worse. Situational phobias pertain to just that, situations that people feel anxious about, such as being interviewed, giving a public speech, or being diagnosed with a serious illness, or even something as extreme as living through a nuclear apocalypse. Whether it be an aversion towards a thing or a moment, it can still be classified as a phobia. And all of these phobias are classified as anxiety disorders, since that is the primary reaction in the host, anxiety. It's important to note though that simply being afraid of something doesn't mean you have a phobia. Having a little anxiousness before giving a presentation doesn't necessarily mean you have glossophobia, the fear of public speaking. Phobias are instead diagnosed when the fear becomes excessive beyond reason to the point of complete avoidance or total dread when exposed to the stimulus in question. Think of it this way: if your fear of a certain object or situation is enough to deter you from doing something, therefore impacting your everyday life, then it probably could be classified as a phobia. A little nervousness about a speech right beforehand probably doesn't constitute a phobia, but dreading an upcoming interview that's weeks away and canceling on it despite it being a great career opportunity just to avoid the interview itself could probably be a phobia, and guess what? You're probably headed towards a diagnosis. What I mean to say is that the aversion has to be significant to the point of it negatively affecting your everyday life. So while the characters of Until Dawn don't really demonstrate any obvious phobias themselves, the game isn't afraid to expose you to stimulus that could certainly be triggering to someone living with a phobia. In fact, right after the first chapter, the game hands you a book of potential anxieties in this therapeutic setting and asks you to identify things you're afraid of. The game uses your responses to affect certain outcomes throughout the game. For example, if you ultimately decide on a snake being your biggest fear, in one of the later therapy scenes, a pesky cobra will be put on display in a jar right in front of you. And if you answer that clowns scare you more than scarecrows, then this encounter in the later portions of the game will have a clown mask instead of a scarecrow mask. This is Supermassive's way of putting your fears as a player into this horror story in about as seamless a way as possible, and I think that's brilliant. Of course, the game also isn't shy about loading its narrative up to the brim with things that may trigger fear in its players, especially those with specific aversions. So bear with me here as I now pronounce these specific phobias, but here we go. Ophidiophobia, arachnophobia, and formidophobia are ones I already mentioned, but there's a lot more to consider. Coulrophobia, acrophobia, ornithophobia, eliphophobia, pyrophobia, and pterophobia are just a few examples that get their own moments in the game. Some phobias are obviously more prominent across our society, like arachnophobia, but others are much more niche, like eliphophobia. These are some of the more object-driven phobias that appear throughout the game, but situational ones do as well. For example, when Chris has to choose between saving Ashley or Josh, and later Ashley or himself, its inspiration from the Saw movies is undeniable. Characters are often stalked throughout the game as well, which demonstrates a type of scopophobia. All of these objects and situations are shown to the player throughout the experience, and the game banks on getting a scare out of you with at least one of them. They have plays on some of the most common phobias as well as some more obscure ones, just to cover their bases. So what causes these phobias in us as humans? Well, psychologists have three distinct answers to that question. The first is that phobias develop through classical conditioning, our tendency to associate emotional reactions such as fear with objects that originally caused that fear. For example, if as a child you fell off of playground equipment and were super scared and kinda hurt, it may lead you to having a fear of heights later on. That direct exposure created such an emotionally resonant moment within you that it became ingrained into your psyche and molded itself into a full-blown phobia. The second answer is that we develop phobias through observational learning as children. When we're kids, if we see someone else having a terrified reaction to a certain stimulus, such as a spider, we pick up on the notion that spiders are dangerous, therefore the person is reacting in such a scared way. We learn to be afraid of it by seeing others being afraid of it first. And thirdly, psychologists posit that some phobias and aversions stem from having a prior knowledge base. For example, you may go to Yellowstone National Park and see a bison, and while it may not be inherently scary, you know how dangerous they can be from seeing clips of bison attacking people before. Your fear stems from your previous knowledge, not from that specific object or situation. Now, in my personal opinion, that last point describes a more general fear rather than a phobia, but I'm not a full-blown psychologist, now am I? Getting back to Until Dawn, the thing that stands out most to me is how intelligently three phobia-triggering concepts were built right into the core design of the game. The one that makes itself most apparent is sonophobia, the fear of sudden loud noises. This is one that I personally experience. I hate thunderstorms, I hate seeing balloons at kids' parties because I know they're gonna pop it and scare the shit out of me, and I hate horror movies because of the jump scares. Until Dawn isn't afraid to throw many jump scares at you throughout its runtime, and they're always accompanied with loud noises to really emphasize the scare. It's a pillar of the game's ability to scare you. The second would be one you've probably heard about before, claustrophobia, the fear of being enclosed in a tight space. Whether you're out in the woods, in the mines, or in the confines of the lodge's basement, Until Dawn never lets you escape that sinking feeling that you're in a confined area, especially in the indoor locales. This is true from a gameplay design standpoint. You can never roam into the woods or out of the house. You are trapped in these small, enclosed hallways and are forced to progress to the next jump scare. And the final one I want to talk about is agoraphobia, the fear of being unable to escape. This also applies to the level design. We're at the mercy of what the developers want us to experience. There is no option to just leave the mountainside and be done with the whole thing. We must progress onward. There's also plenty of chase sequences and tough choice moments throughout the game that demonstrate this fear as well. To me, the game not only shows off fear-inducing content in its moment-to-moment gameplay, but it also takes common anxieties and builds them into its level design for the betterment of the game. To wrap this video up, I want to look at 3 ways in which phobias can be cured, because trust me, it's not a hopeless endeavor. The most detailed of which would be systematic desensitization, an approach where the fear patient is slowly introduced to elevating levels of exposure to the source of their fear. For example, a person with a clown phobia may first be shown drawings and pictures of clowns until they become comfortable with being around those photos. Then maybe clown dolls or toys are introduced until they too become non-triggering. Following that, the person may be asked to watch a video of a circus performance where clowns entertain people, and finally, they may attend a full-blown circus performance themselves. Each step is about getting the person one step closer to facing their fear, and once they do experience it in its entirety, they come to realize the fear that they had wasn't very logical or anything to be afraid of. A more generalized approach to curing phobia would be your standard cognitive behavioral therapy, in which a therapist and patient work together to uncover the source of a phobia. Once the triggering experience is identified, the therapist and patient work through the trauma and expose it to the point that the patient begins to understand how irrational or illogical their fear is. Perhaps a fear of heights stemmed into a fear of flying for a person, but by examining the root cause of the aversion and then seeing statistics and information on how safe flying truly is, the person comes to learn that their fear wasn't justified. And finally, if a therapist is having issues with reaching the root cause of a phobia, they may turn to hypnotherapy, in which a person is induced into a deep trance in order to access their unconscious mind so that they can speak freely about their past experience. This really isn't a form of therapy on its own, but it can be an integral step in uncovering the source of a phobia. So, phobias can take hold of a person's life and lead them to a complete distancing from many aspects of life if they associate it with their fear. Whether it be towards an object or a situation, phobias are a deep-rooted fear that affects their everyday lives and the choices that they make. They can stem from traumatic experiences, by watching and learning the fears of others, or through accessing prior knowledge to estimate the danger level of a certain situation or object. Through counseling and therapy, just about all phobias can be overcome if the person is willing enough to face their fear. And perhaps that's the most important part of this. Phobias can be overcome, and by doing so, maybe Until Dawn will become a better experience in your eyes, one that you can appreciate as a horror game designed to scare you. The game, from its level design to its moment-to-moment gameplay, is all about throwing as many different horrifying situations and encounters at the player as possible in hopes that one of them is going to stick its landing and scare the bejesus out of you. And this is the phobia triggering power of Until Dawn. If you found this video fascinating, be sure to check out the rest of the Psychology of Gaming playlist for more quick lessons like this. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.